Newstalk Breakfast.
In association with Air. Do anything, anywhere with high-speed 4G mobile data coverage across 96% of the population.
This is Newstalk.
All this month here on Newstalk Breakfast, we've been examining the causes and impacts of violence against women in our society. We've heard from survivors of violence, support groups, academics, Gardaí, legislators, as we examined the causes and effects that this violence can have. Now, in the final part of our series, last night here in Dublin, we convened an expert panel to discuss and debate the various issues that have arisen throughout this series. I was joined on the panel by Noeleen Blackwell, who's CEO of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, Owen O'Neill, who's the CEO of Move Ireland. Now, Move Ireland is Men Overcoming Violence. Activist Niamh Dhomhnaill and Labour's leader in the Seanad, Ivana Bacik. Ivana began by giving me her thoughts on the Domestic Violence Act that will, among other changes, provide for a new criminal offence of coercive control.
It's very welcome. We're not alone in recognising that this is a very serious part of domestic violence, of violent behaviour that is coercive. What we're talking about when we talk about coercive control is behaviour that controls somebody, that effectively limits their freedom or their liberty in some way, that stops them, for example, a partner who stops their partner from going out of the house, who spies on them in terms of emails, in terms of phone calls, who controls their behaviour. And that may be done through simply creating a fear in them. It may not be done through physical violence at all. Quite often there is no physical violence, but it's a threat of physical violence or a threat of or serious alarm or distress. It's been criminalised in England, coercive control, for the last 2.5 years. There's been over 500 successful prosecutions to date. And there's very useful research from England that shows us that coercive control is a feature in 92% of domestic violence homicides. So in other words, that controlling behaviour in a relationship can be a real indicator that very serious violence may follow. So this is a real feature, and it's something we do need to prosecute.
It's a very, very insidious process. We've all met people who've gone through this and have been the victims of it, because it's done gradually and very slowly and imperceptibly a lot of the time, and they strip the person of their self-esteem and their confidence.
That's right. Yes.
Now, my issue with it is this, and I asked this question during one of the programmes we did on this, is you're a barrister. You know what goes on down in the circus, sometimes we refer to as the courts. It's to prove a case, a criminal case, beyond all reasonable doubt, is a very, very difficult thing. So, but now you have this coercive control it's nebulous. You can't put your finger on it. You can't take a photograph of it. How difficult, and I know you said 500 cases, maybe just tell us about how difficult it is or what kind of challenges there are in proving that.
Well, certainly you're right in saying that this is often a more insidious form of control or form of coercion over a person. Certainly more insidious than a physical violence, but it can have a much more serious and long-term effect in terms of ruining somebody's self-esteem and ruining their and really destroying their personality. Evidence is a crucial question. How do you prove this? The new Act in Section 39 sets out a very clear series of criteria or tests for when when behaviour becomes a criminal offence. And basically it requires that a person would persistently engage in controlling or coercive behaviour that causes somebody else to fear that violence will be used against them, or to cause them serious alarm or distress that really impacts on their day-to-day activities. So the test that is set out, I think, is robust enough and clear enough that it will be capable of being policed. As I say, we've had already quite a number of events with Gardaí where we have experts like Davina James-Hanman, who's worked extensively with British police on this, on how they police it. And so crucially for guards and for police here is training in how to spot the signs of coercive control. But the Act does set out these criteria, and I should say the Act is also going to make a huge impact in other areas too, of course. For example, for judges, it sets out a list of criteria for judges to take into account when they're asked to decide whether or not to grant a barring order or a safety order. So in many ways, not just with coercive control, but in other ways too, the Act is going to, I think, help those involved in trying to bring offenders to justice, because it's setting out clear criteria and clear lists of factors for judges and for police to
Is there a supportive network? That's why I referred to earlier about the victim here. they're always 99% of the time they're on the floor with they've no self-esteem, they've no confidence, so they're already easy prey for a good defence lawyer. Is there any sort of criteria for trying to get that information from them and encourage them and support them right through this process? Because you know what I mean, like so many cases, domestics right across the world, police research shows that in the vast majority of cases, why cops become cynical about it is that they go to domestics, there's a predictable cycle. They say a lot of majority cases the spouse or the injured party will withdraw the complaint because of what I've just laid out there.
Yes, you do find this attitude prevailing across police forces. The Gardaí are not alone. Certainly anyone who's looked at the Policing Inspectorate report in 2014 that looked at the culture within the Gardaí, one of the big criticisms the Policing Inspectorate made was the guards weren't taking domestic violence seriously enough, that they weren't following up and prosecuting. So I think one of the things, the positive things that a new offensive course of control will do is it will require guards to look at these sort of factors beyond evidence, for example, of physical abuse. It will require them to look also for this sort of controlling behaviour that may well often lead to or be a sign of further violence to come.
It certainly would be.
It will require training, though.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt.
It would be a major innovation from policing in Ireland, because it is a whole new area of investment, and it would take a lot of skill, like a lot more training to be able to get into that.
But we are already in a position, I think, where because of the Policing Inspector report, because of other reports, where the guards are aware of the need to train up specialists in this area, in domestic violence and sexual abuse and so on. So I think there have been, and I mean, Noeleen and others will be able to talk about it, but I think there have been great improvements made in terms of service provision for victims by the Gardaí, particularly where you're talking about victims in domestic violence and sexual abuse cases where you do need specialist training. But I think having an offence there on the statute book for the first time is really going to help with that, and it will help make guards more aware about this sort of insidious controlling behaviour. Okay,
thanks, Ivana. I go to you, Noeleen. You know, support. I saw you nodding your head vigorously then about supports for women in these situations.
Just one of the things about the crime as well, Paul. It's really interesting. This is the first time domestic violence has been categorised as criminal. Before that, it was always in the private family law courts, where, in a sense, nobody ever got sent to jail or anything unless they were found to breach an order of the court. And you were saying about how very often these cases are withdrawn. And very often it is because the abuse is so awful that the person is afraid to go forward. The thing about a criminal charge is that the guards can insist on bringing the case forward, you know, without the abused person having to be the person who starts the whole process going. So that's really important. And that's why this legislation, by making that criminal case, which allows the guards, who often know that there are bad things happening in a place, allows them to go forward, even if the person is in such fear they won't go forward themselves. And also that business of making the judges sort of address a whole list of different things to give a barring order is a real advance as well, and something that's been looked for maybe 20 or 30 years by the lawyers. But in terms of supports, the thing about it again is recognising that domestic violence for an awful lot of time is a series of behaviours. It's not just one incident or something. The kind of supports that are needed are different ones. Ivana pointed very correctly to the need for the guards as a primary source of support to be available. But then very often people do not want to involve the guards. And that's why Women's Aid helpline, the national helpline that they run, is key. That anyone can, if they can just get to a phone, no matter what their language is actually, they can phone the Women's Aid helpline. And very often all they want to be able to say at that stage is, how would you be around if I needed help later? So people will try and make arrangements when and as they're ready. And there are refuges around the country. Now, of course, the thing you have to say about refuges is there are a lot more people looking for refuge spaces than there are refuges available. And it's a real source of concern that somebody might be at serious risk without being able to get away. The other thing is that the state-funded legal aid system is there. The Legal Aid Board is there, its solicitors, to bring civil cases to get the protection order. Now you can apply out, if you're down the country in the middle of a Saturday and there's no court open, you can still apply for an emergency barring order. I think that's coming in very soon, Ivana, that legislation. So the range of supports is there, but it's not enough. The Child and Family Agency is there and will have its own part to play in terms of child protection, but people are often don't want that approach either, because they feel that their children are going to be taken away from them, because again they need more resources in order to be able to do supportive family management.
Can I go back to the coercive control? This is, as somebody who's been observing and writing about this for 30 years, I found the coercive control a really new, quite innovative departure. What do you make of it?
So, first of all, the Council of Europe requires us to have a crime, to make it a criminal offence that somebody would be a victim of domestic violence, that they would have a criminal remedy available to them. I think this is a very clever solution. It is a solution that recognises that domestic violence, above all else, is perpetrated over time, that it builds up, that it can be all about creating fear, creating isolation in somebody, not allowing them to be the person that they are themselves. It can have elements of sexual violence in it. It can have elements of financial control in it. It can have physical violence in it as well. But whatever it is, it's just a way of allowing the length of time that domestic violence takes place to be properly recognised in the criminal court system.
But it is a very, very complex process to try and unravel, because this is what we've talking about. This is the years and years. Yeah. It's like the sea bashing against the stone on the beach.
But the thing is, when this legislation was first introduced, or some legislation like it was first introduced, everyone was saying, oh sure, don't bother with that, it doesn't work. And it was only in the last year or so that the English cases are coming through and saying an awful lot of them aren't proved. That the accused person says that's simply not the case, and the case is dismissed. But over 500, and it's very recent, have been found to be guilty of this kind of controlling behaviour. I was going to ask
you, Ivana, a moment ago there. Is there any data available to say that 500 cases that have been proved in the UK courts, what percentage is that of the overall figure of cases that were brought for trial? I'm just interested. I'm trying to get a sort of handle on what's the success rate in this kind of legislation.
As I say, at a very recent Safe Ireland seminar where we had all the stakeholders and guards and so on present, we had a great paper from Davina James-Hamnan, who's this expert from Britain on policing of coercive control. She said 532 successful prosecutions across 29 police forces in England and Wales, out of 4,246 cases recorded. But she said, bear in mind, the numbers of women who experience domestic violence, of course, is much bigger than that. But of cases recorded, over 4,000.
So that's a significant start.
It's very
significant.
A good start. Yeah. Now, it should be said that in many of these cases, coercive control is not the only offence. In other words, you may have a number of different offences. You may have breach of a barring order. You may have indeed assault offences. You may have threats, threatening behaviour. But coercive control as at least one of those offences for which a conviction is recorded. So it is very significant, and as Noeleen says, it's very recent. I mean, if you look, this is only 2.5 years old. Generally, I mean, as anyone involved in crime, as you will know, it does take a number of years for new offences to bed down, for guards to get used to them,
and lessons to be learned from
and
each
lessons
case,
to be learned. That's right. So it is very, very significant then that we've seen such an increase in numbers recorded. Now, she was very clear that not every police force is prosecuting to the same extent. That this is something that you see some police forces taking more seriously than others, but undoubtedly a culture will spread as people become more used to the idea. And there will be
case law in which we can use in our courts.
That's right. And also then victims of themselves and victims' families, and people become aware of the idea of coercive control, and we start to spot signs in people, relationships we know.
I want to switch over to Niamh, because that's the theoretical framework, and we're looking at the law and all of that. But Niamh, you're in the unique position that you have had to go through the system yourself. But could you tell us, first of all, what your personal journey was like from the time, say, the law enforcement and the courts get involved and you go towards that scary place called the court system?
Well, I was in probably the legal system for about 5 years, so it's quite a long time. The initial going to the guards, I mean, I think the thing is that, like, it was it had just happened. I had just realised what had happened. And I think that's a really big component of all this. And what's quite interesting is that we're talking so much about agencies and legislation and training the guards, but what's really missing in this conversation, as far as I'm concerned, with all due respect to everyone, is like the individuals themselves and the awareness. Because you can't go to the guards, you can't kind of try for a case to be prosecuted if you don't have awareness of what's going on. So
awareness of your rights, awareness of the criminal justice process. Is that what you're talking?
Awareness of the acts themselves. Like, I mean, particularly with something like coercive control, I think for a lot of people, it's a very, very new concept. So as much as it's great that there's a Domestic Violence Act that's including coercive control and that there's training for the guards, what's also really important is awareness and education for the rest of us. And I for me, that's key, because you can't have prosecutions, you can't have cases being brought forward if we don't have people who are aware of it. And if I kind of reflect that back to my own experience, and something that I know a lot of people kind of nitpicked with my own case was that if I realised the first time what Magnus did, why did I stay? And that was because I wasn't framing it as rape originally.
This is the case where this man, you'd been involved in a relationship with him at the time.
I was in a relationship with him for 11 months, yeah.
He basically abused you when you were asleep, and he told you about it afterwards. And that's, yours was a bit of a landmark case, if I say so myself. You know, it got a lot of publicity at the time.
It did, yeah. And I mean, like, if I'm honest, there was certainly plenty of coercive control there as well.
And I meant to say, because you bravely and very courageously came out and spoke about it so openly. Sorry, and that's going back to the awareness why it's so important.
It is.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, not at all. But I mean, I think that there has to be kind of space for us as a society to talk about it, to reflect on it, to talk about the cases that come through the legal system. And I think that's, I don't think the legal system does a lot for victims or complainants or individuals who go through it. I think what it does do, or what it does give us, are examples where we can talk about a case. And that's a real privilege, I think. As a society. Well, no, it was a privilege of mine, and it continues to be a privilege of mine to be able to speak about it. What I mean is that legal cases that come through, that are prosecuted, hopefully successfully, give us as a society something to kind of look at and examine and question. And I suppose my case was one where we could really kind of pick apart the idea of consent. And, you know, whatever about the legal system, the outcome is really irrelevant in terms of an individual's experience of the criminal justice system in some respects, because it's a horrendous system to go through, and it gaslights you at various
Well, it's only
points.
through people like yourself. I say, I'm in the media 30-odd years doing this. But the thing about what I always found, and what we always had huge respect for, is the brave victims like yourself who come forward. Because isn't it correct, Noeleen, that, and Ivana, I know you'd agree with me, and Owen as well, that if people like yourself didn't come out on the steps of the courts and dramatically apply to the court, say, look, I want to waive my right to anonymity, I want to tell the world what's going on here. It takes an awful lot of courage, a huge amount of courage to do that. But it's you create more awareness for the victims out there than any of the rest of us could put together.
I don't think it's courage, and like I get in trouble every time I say this. It's not about bravery or courage. I think sometimes you're really frustrated and you're sick of a system that's telling that, you know, in my case just said, well, like, but he admitted he was guilty. So, you know, like that's really good.
Noeleen, you're dying to get in there. I know you are. Because I would just add to bring on that. Like, what can we do for people
well, first of all,
to ensure that they get the best experience they possibly can get out of this?
I think it's really important that what Niamh is saying, first of all, and because you'll ask me about services and the rest of it, but it is true to say that unless we can talk about it, you know, the level of courage you were saying was needed, Paul, to talk about these, it shouldn't be necessary. It should be possible to say, in the same way you can say my phone was stolen, to be able to say I was raped, or I was sexually assaulted, or I'm a victim of the crime of domestic violence. These should be things that you should be able to say in our society, and that people would recognise and support you in saying that. So when Niamh and others that are here, that you'll be talking to, talk about their experience, they help to, and I don't mean that it's a normal experience, but they help to normalise it, because she's not alone. You're not alone.
Exactly.
We know, as a matter of fact, that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men are victims of sexual violence at some stage over their lifetime, not to talk of the domestic violence. So, but what it does is, what it is helpful for is we use the individual story, all of us. The stories need to be told in order to make that greater general awareness that was there. So the questions Niamh so articulately has raised all the times, and her activity in ensuring that we continue to move towards a more evidence-based approach to sexual violence. She's one of the big supporters of better evidence. All of these things mean that we may get more realistic services for people in need. So for her, we need, and for everybody else, we need to make sure that people are educated, that sex without consent is rape.
Dhomhnaill, sitting there patiently, CEO of MOVE, the Men Overcoming Violence. We're talking about the accused. We've heard about the process of the courts. We've heard what the victim has to endure. You're dealing with you're truly, like they say, that the penury system or the penal system is supposed to be about rehabilitation of the offender. Now, our criminal justice system doesn't really reoffend. However, you are truly in the rehabilitative business because you deal with the perpetrators. They come to you through various avenues, either self-referral or they're referred by courts or TUSLA or whatever, GPs. So you meet these people. You're the first guy to meet them when they're they've taken the first step towards an attempt to reform themselves. Will you tell us what is involved in your business, basically, what you do with these people?
Well, what's involved is really, firstly, we get the referral and we try and collect as much information about that man before we would see him. And really the first couple of meetings that we would have with the man, they are key, really, because we need to know that this man is serious about changing his behaviour. We need to know what his motivations are, and we need to know, has he got the capacity to stick at our programme, which requires a man really to be with us between 6 and 9 months.
And when you say 6 or 9 months, is it a residential facility or it's a daytime?
It's a weekly group work programme which is supported by individual work pre, during and after the group work. So they are with us quite a considerable period of time. But really, before we take any man on, we need to know that they are genuine in their ability and thinking and attitudes around changing. And that is a real challenge because about 50% of the men that come to us, they don't make it through the treatment. They're there for all the wrong reasons.
They're trying to impress a judge. Yeah. They're trying to get themselves off, trying to get back into the partner's good books.
Yeah,
that must be a very difficult process to try and, weed those individuals out, because there are very manipulative people to start with.
They are, but we, our facilitators have years of experience. So they're well trained, they're very skilled, and they've seen these men come through the door. Now, sometimes we get it wrong. First couple of meetings, we think this man is really motivated. Then they arrive in group and, their attitude totally changes. They, in a group setting, it is a challenging group environment. So the denial and the resistance builds up at the start. It's a process that we challenge the men on a continual basis about their participation, their engagement, their honesty.
It's to my mind, my amateur mind about this, it's akin to dealing with alcoholics, drug addicts, gambling addicts. The first thing they have to do is they have to try and accept that they have a problem, that they have reached rock bottom. Is that correct?
Yes.
Before that you can in any way reasonably try and approach the issue that we're going to try and break this down.
The rock bottom analogy isn't helpful, I don't think. I've worked in addictions as well, and we see people coming to our service just in the same, in addiction services, people come in crisis. They come when all the damage has been done. And really part of the awareness that Niamh's talking about is about getting men earlier, getting them to be aware of their abusive behaviour. A lot of men come to us and they say, I don't have a problem, I don't hit my wife. You know, they don't recognise the coercive control, the emotional abuse. So it is really key that we raise awareness, that we get men earlier before all the damage has been done.
I just want to ask you, again, is this being naive of me? I would think that there would be two broad categories. I know it's very complex and every individual case is the same, or different, obviously, and not the same. That on one hand, you've just got people who are playing bad, and then the other offenders are people with various forms of psychological difficulties.
Yeah, although, you know, these men are our sons, they're our brothers, they're our neighbours, they're our work colleagues, you know, so I think demonising these men as if there's some alien species out there, in the same way that we view all alcoholics as those who are street drinkers, you know, that's not the case. You know,
no, what I was trying to get it to is there a sort of a dichotomy between them? Is there a cohort that are just people who have that you can't really get to what the problem is? They're just not nice people and they're just violent people. And then are there other people who have various psychological issues that are propelling them towards this violence? You know what I mean? Yeah. Like an abusive childhood, alcoholic father, or a guy like we've met loads of people like that through, you know, people just are bad people who just go out and kill other people and nobody can explain them.
Yeah. Well, we believe every man has the potential for change. So we don't see particular men as being evil and beyond help and beyond change. I think there is an issue around capacity and life experience and their whole, how they see the world. You know, they are definitely factors in terms of helping men change. For some men, you know, they don't have the capacity. They have, you know, possibly horrendous life experience, mental health problems, but that still doesn't mean, you know, they're not victims. You know, they still have a choice. There are loads of men out there who have had horrendous childhoods.
Well, the victim becomes the victimizer.
Yeah, but those men don't end up being abusive. So at any one moment, men have a choice to either be abusive or not.
I think too, just
Noeleen.
to, I mean, again, just in the area that we're dealing in, we're talking about domestic violence, we're talking about sexual violence. Again, we can't stress enough how different those are from, say, an assault by a stranger. You are talking about people who know each other really well, intimate with each other. In domestic violence, it kind of goes with the territory that there has to be a domestic relationship. In sexual violence, almost always, it's very intimate, very well known. That affects it. So if we just take, even those of us who have no experience of this, know any family dynamic is a difficult one. And you add into that then the violence. And it's always makes these cases different to everything. I'm not special pleading, but they are different.
Of course, human behaviour is complex, and this is perhaps the most complex end of the whole human interaction.
There's a lot of talk at the moment about these ACEs. Everybody knows about them forever, but these adverse childhood experiences, and there is no doubt about it that adverse childhood experiences will affect your behaviour later on when you go on. But I mean, I think the other thing is true as well. If your behaviour is criminal, if your behaviour is harmful, it has to be addressed. Now,
we are coming to the end of this. I would like to come back. You said something earlier there, Noeleen, and also Niamh mentioned it. And it is, if we're to deal with this issue going forward as a modern, so-called sophisticated society, and we're to try and do as much as we can, we're never going to rid it because human beings will always be abusing each other. You mentioned the word education. Now, do you tell me what your view is on that at the moment? Do we bring a programme into the schools, like Niamh touched on, I'm going back to Niamh in a moment about this, about the whole issue of consent, educating people about consent. Like, I remember when my son was growing up, I always told him, you never, ever, ever hit your sister. You never hit a woman, ever. Yeah. You know, that was the thing I instilled in him from he's a young lad. How do we because there's a lot of challenges, especially for young people now compared to ever before. How do we prepare our young Irish men coming up to be people who will respect their women and respect all women and not be violent towards them or abusive?
It's our young men and our young women. We were lucky enough to get a free stand down at Body and Soul Festival there last month. And we asked people who were going through 2 questions. One, what their idea of consent was. And the other, what was the thing you wished you had known sooner? Almost inevitably, when young people were asked what was it they wished they'd known sooner, it was, I wish I'd known how to communicate. I wish I had known that I could have said no. I wish I had known that I didn't have to go to what I did. So it's almost tear making, the fact that our schools and our societies, our clubs are not instilling this understanding of respect for other people. Just what you were talking about there in your own family, you were raising your own children to be respectful of others.
The vast majority of people do that.
And this is true of men and women. It's not just for our boys, it's for our girls as well. It's for everyone to understand it. That's at one level. The other level at which we have to really train people is to say never to condone sexual harm or harassment, not to say to somebody who's harassing somebody, look, just ignore him, that's all right, or he's a good fellow behind it all. Never to blame somebody for the fact that they're a victim of domestic or sexual crime. So we have to work with our society, and we have to get to a place where the Niamhs of this world and everybody else can just say, I am just going through an awful process. I have been badly hurt and harmed by an assault that was done to me, and I need to be able to talk about that the way I could.
And we have to be able to, and we must. Society must have a big warm.
Huge ideas on this as well.
But society must have a big warm blanket to put around them and make it feel that they're wanted, that they're listened to, and they are entitled.
And
to
that
speak out.
The person who did it must never do it again.
Niamh, sorry, I was coming back to you, and you know this better than anybody. What would you like to see? Like, you are very much part of this now educational process, because you are very articulate. You're expressing, this happened to me. This is why I am speaking out. This is what people need to know. What do you feel needs to be done to just educate people, to try and, as I said, the proposition I put up, to make the next generation of Irish men a little bit more noble, perhaps?
It's a big task. I actually think the biggest tool that we have is the media. I think it's perhaps a lot more effective than education programs that go into schools or workplaces, because it's a completely different buy-in. I think what the media allows us, not maybe through court cases, but I'm conscious to not make everything about the legal system, because not everything is about the legal system, and because most individuals will never disclose to any individual, let alone go through a legal process. So, and I think I'm quite uncomfortable with this idea of making heroes out of individuals like myself who have gone through the criminal justice system and waived their anonymity, because I'm personally uncomfortable with it, because I feel that there's so many other people, and many of whom have come to me and have said, well, like, I'm not like you because I've never told anyone, and you're great for doing that. And I really don't like that. It's probably
down to personality as well. But I know you're modest about it, but like, I'm expressing from a heartfelt sort of a long experience of dealing with this from way back, and meeting so many people from so many different horrendous experiences. And when I say you're heroic, and people do, and we in the media tend to feel that way about people like yourself speak out, because we're aware of how difficult. There's so many people. For every person like you, there's 1,000 people who won't and are terrified, and they look up to you, but they'll watch you and you will give them encouragement. So that to me is heroic.
I really think what's really important is the media and the media's role, and what narratives and what stories the media are telling when they talk about sexual violence or domestic abuse. My sense is that sometimes there is already almost a template that's just there, and that's how we talk about abuse, that's how we talk about victims, that's how we talk about perpetrators. And what I would love to see is a little bit more nuance, like actually asking questions that are just, because the thing is, like, I would never say I can speak for all individuals or any individuals who've experienced sexual violence. I can only speak from my own
Well, every
perspective.
experience is unique, of course.
Absolutely. And I would love to see that teased out in media, and I don't necessarily believe that it is. I think we see the same words, the same set of adjectives used for victims and perpetrators. And I would just...
Is that probably because that it is such a sensitive area that people are trying to be really sensitive and handling it very, very carefully, the whole subject, because it's a relatively new phenomenon for victims to be speaking out on.
Yeah. I think it's that, but I think we have to push past that. Like, it's an uncomfortable topic. We just kind of have to get on with that, and we have to push that forward. I think personally, I feel that we're a little bit stagnant in terms of how we discuss these topics. I think we could do with pushing it forward a little bit more, asking more difficult questions, looking at the language that we use, asking, are we, like, personally, I don't like being referred to as a victim or a survivor. I understand that I am. I understand, like, in contexts like this, I will be referred to as a victim or survivor. That's fine.
How would you like to be referred to?
Niamh Ní Dhomhnaill.
I'm just trying to get my head around what we say to people in the future, because I want to be educated in this, and I want to try and help be part of the educational process. So you educate me.
I think it's about each person deciding for themselves what they want to be called. Like, I've read some really interesting pieces around some people who say, I want to be called a victim because what happened to me was awful, and I bear the hurt and I bear the scars for that. And that's totally fine, and that's their prerogative. And I think it's just about each individual. And it comes back to this idea of nuance in individuals, leaving space for them to be them and to kind of tell their story. Okay.
Owen, I give the last word to yourself, because you mentioned the word, we've mentioned education, but you also mentioned when you were talking there a while ago, just awareness. It's very important. What do you see? Like, you're the expert on the front line dealing with the perpetrators, the offenders. How do you see your role going forward, or how do you see the formulation of some kind of template for dealing with the future young men, the future generations in our attitudes? Because the world is changing very quickly.
Look, I'll say a couple of things. One, this is fundamentally about gender equality. I think if it's only, and I'm not saying only, if it's about domestic violence, men will turn off because they'll say, that's not me. But gender equality is an issue for all men. It is so pervasive, but that's where the wins are going to be made in terms of achieving mutual respect and genuine equality among the sexes. Now, I think the other thing about that is that men need to step up and take it on as an issue. Like, for years, it has been a woman's issue, but it's not. It's a man's issue. So men need to support those women that are really pushing against all the barriers and all the blockages in their way. Men need to confront their own friends. They need to talk to their friends about sexist behaviour, inappropriate attitudes, all the rest. Now, there's some work out there, the Man Up campaign, which Save Ireland ran, the White Ribbon campaign, which is, held every day, which is about, against violence towards women. So there's grains there, which we can build on, but clearly it's been left too long as a women's issue. And I suppose I would, reach out, to men, to actually start owning this issue for themselves.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I want to thank everybody who turned up. Ivana Bacik, I would thank her in absentia. She's left us. She had to leave early. Noeleen Blackwell, CEO of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. Owen O'Neill, CEO of Move Ireland. And of course, most importantly, Niamh Ní Dhomhnaill. Thank you all very, very much for participating in this debate. I think it's a subject we'll come back to. It's certainly nothing that has been resolved or going to go away anytime soon. And we won't let it. That's our job. And hopefully we'll live up to that. And thank you all very, very much for coming.